Okay, so we saw in the last lecture, in the last part of part two that we read, Rousseau's argument for how communal life began, how people went from being completely isolated and asocial in the state of nature to beginning to live together in these first sort of villages. But again, this wasn't yet really society as we understand it today. There was no real inequality. There were some natural inequalities that began to emerge, or maybe even they were somewhat conventional. Maybe they were even somewhat conventional inequalities. People started to prefer this person over this person. They started to think this person is more beautiful than this person. But some of them were still just maybe natural inequalities. This person is stronger or better at hunting because they are stronger. So there were some inequalities, but there were not really permanent social inequalities. There were not the kind of inequalities that exist once you start to have private property and so on. So Rousseau describes that sort of intermediate stage between the state of nature and civil society. He says this was the best state for human beings. If the human race was going to be happy, we would have stayed there forever. He uses examples from contemporary history, contemporary for him, of various people who, savages as he calls them. Again, he doesn't mean this in a negative way. In fact, he means it in a positive way. But basically uncivilized people who have traveled to Europe sometimes and despised it and thought that life there was really not that great. They were not impressed by European society. And he addresses this in the end note, and he says that maybe if you think, well, it's just custom, it's just habit, people who just prefer whatever they're used to. He says, but many Europeans who go and live among savages, in fact, greatly prefer that way of life. And he says, it shows that that's what's really natural. So how did we come to leave it then? How did this terrible thing happen, which Rousseau says has doomed the human race to misery for the rest of time? Because as he says, you can't go back. It's this sort of fatal thing that happens, and then there is no return. Even though he kind of suggests that people once they had sort of made this terrible fateful step and they had established property and they begun to lose their natural freedom, they realized that it was a terrible mistake, and yet it was too late to undo it. So how did it happen? And he basically says there are two arts in particular that really need to account for how all of this came to change. And they are metallurgy, in other words, the ability to melt and make tools out of metal, especially iron, and agriculture. And he says these are the two arts that changed everything once people began to develop them. Because again, he says, as long as people were doing things, as long as people's tasks, their jobs, what they were doing, hunting, building huts, making clothes, some basic things like that, as long as what they were doing could be done by one person, and therefore as long as they were basically free in that way, they could take care of everything for themselves, then he says everything was good, and people retained their natural freedom, and you had that intermediate stage, that happiest stage of human existence. He says once bigger tasks began to be undertaken, and you had the need for a kind of permanent division of labor. So not just two people go fishing and one holds each end of the net, but once you get into agriculture and metallurgy, things that require a kind of permanent division of labor and therefore permanent reliance of one person on another for things like food, then Rousseau says that's when things finally change. That's when people really lose their natural freedom and become dependent on other people. So it's these big projects, these big arts of agriculture and metallurgy that changes everything. He considers where they could have come from. He says, as with language, it's very difficult to understand how metallurgy, how the art of actually smelting metals would have ever originated, who would have ever come up with it. He says it's impossible to imagine a savage man, primitive man going around and doing experiments trying to melt metals and make tools out of them. They would never get that idea on their own. He says it's even less likely to think that somehow people were just in a mine shaft and accidentally a fire broke out and they saw, oh look, fire can melt metal and then we can turn it into tools and so on. He says probably what happened was that there was a volcano and this eruption, this sort of molten metal came out, and people began to realize, look, this metal is hard, but we can, if we heat it enough, then it will soften and we can turn it into tools. And so it was this purely accidental thing, which again goes along with his idea that this sort of intermediate stage is the best for human beings. Unless something accidental like that happens, people don't go looking for a way out of that state. There's nothing impelling them or compelling them to leave that intermediary state, that state where they're living in a communal life, they have families and so on. But they still don't have civil society. Only the accident of seeing a sort of volcanic eruption and beginning to think of metalworking in that way, that's what sort of makes it possible for them to leave. So he says maybe it was a volcanic eruption. They saw that. They started to think we should go and get this. We should go and get this metal. And so then they started working in that way. He says the principles of agriculture would have been a lot easier for them to understand, right? I mean, they were used to eating food, in particular plants, fruit, vegetables, and so on. It must have been relatively easy for them to have noticed, hey, these apples fall on the ground near the tree. There are more apple trees growing there later. At some point, it must have been relatively early that people began to understand what was going on. But he says they wouldn't have actually developed the art of agriculture for a lot of reasons he gives. They wouldn't have had tools to till the ground without actual private property. Why would you plant something when anybody can come and take it, and no one had the concept of private property yet? Other things, but maybe the most important, he says, is what would be required for that is to accept a temporary loss for the idea of future gain, months from now. So you have some food right here, berries or wheat or whatever, and you think, I can put this in the ground and even more will grow, but that will be months from now. Whereas I can eat it right now, and Rousseau says to the mind of savage man, to the mind of primitive man, nothing is more foreign than this kind of far-sighted thinking. So if you have something right now, you eat it. You don't throw it in the ground and give and accept that loss for the sake of greater returns or greater yields later. So Rousseau says it's very, very hard to understand how they would have come, not so much to understand agriculture or to conceive of how they might have done that, but to actually begin to practice it. So he says actually it must have been metallurgy that came first, and then people began to practice agriculture, because once people began to work in the mines and work with iron ore, and iron and so on, they could no longer provide their own food. And therefore they needed someone else to do that for them so that they could devote themselves to working with, retrieving and working with the iron. And therefore people began to practice agriculture so that they could raise more food, more wheat and whatnot, for a larger number of people than they had ever needed before, because again, in the past, everyone would just go and get their own food. Now you need 10 people to raise food for 20 people, because the other 10 people are working in the mines or whatever. So he says that must have been when they started to practice metallurgy. And so he says, that's how that happened. And he says, when you begin to practice agriculture, the plowing of the land, that's when you begin to divide it. And that's where private property starts to come into play. You need to divide the land because people need to work it, and they're only going to work, you're going to divide it just as a simple matter of division of labor. You're going to divide the land into different fields, and everybody plows their own field. And he says, and that's where the first ideas of justice came from. Because if you understand justice as a sort of simple definition of giving to each his own, as somewhat along the lines of what Polemachus said it was, but justice is just giving to each his own. That only makes sense if there's a concept of property. So now that you have land divided into fields and so on, and each person is working their own field, you begin to have some development of a concept of justice, that each person, something is proper to each person, something belongs to each person, and justice involves giving them what is theirs, what is really proper to them, fitting to them, and so on. And he also says that then people begin to sort of, the other sort of source, or the other thing that creates this sense of justice, is also that now that people are thinking into the future, now they are practicing agriculture, and therefore they're thinking we plow and plant the land today, we tend it, we harvest it in the fall, and he's saying that therefore since they started to think into the future, therefore people began to have more of a sense of, if I harm someone, they will retaliate. Now that people could think into the future in this way, and therefore again that's where the idea of justice comes from, is beginning to think in this way, beginning to understand now that there can be retaliation if I harm somebody. Rousseau agrees with Locke. Property comes from mixing your labor with nature. He says, how else could there be any claim to something in the natural world? What else could you add to it other than your own labor? So he says that's where the idea of property comes from, and he says everything might have stayed at this stage, may have remained relatively equal with everybody having equal plots of land, but he said natural inequalities led to unequal success in work. The strong were able to plow more. The adroit were able to work better. The clever were able to find more efficient ways to do it. Some people needed more of this, some people needed more of that, and therefore there was unequal success in work, unequal demand for the product of work, and therefore eventually social inequality began to emerge. And so then as you begin to have inequality, some people are wealthier, some people are not, then you have this fundamental change. And this is what he describes at length in this brilliant paragraph on pages 118 to 119 of this edition. So he begins by saying, and so again, he's sort of saying now we have inequality because of these developments. And he says, behold then all our faculties developed, memory and imagination brought into play, pride stimulated, reason made active, and the mind almost at the point of the perfection of which it is capable. Behold all the natural qualities called into action, the rank and destiny of each man established, not only as to the quantity of his possessions and his power to serve or to injure, but as to intelligence, beauty, strength, skill, merit, or talents. And since these qualities were the only ones that could attract consideration, it soon became necessary either to have them or to feign them. It was necessary in one's own interest to seem to be other than one was in reality. Being and appearance became two entirely different things, and from this distinction arose insolent ostentation, deceitful cunning, and all the vices that follow in their train. So Rousseau says, now that you have this inequality, everybody's destiny is set, because again, you can't just go out and get your own food now. Somebody owns the land. You can't just go out and just live as a free person now. You're part of this social order where you have a particular function, and your natural freedom is lost. Natural inequality has been lost. Now that there are inequalities in society, and therefore Rousseau says people's rank is set and their destiny is set, not just by how much possession they have, not just by their ability to harm other people or to fend off other people, but by these other social qualities that have emerged now. As he puts it, intelligence, beauty, strength, skill, merit, or talents. And so he says, if you don't actually have these things, because this is what impresses people, other than wealth, other than just the ability to fight against them, he says it's these other things, beauty, intelligence, merit, talents, wittiness, all of these things. He says, this is what impresses people. And therefore, Rousseau says you have to either have them, or if you don't have them, you have to feign them. You have to pretend to have them. You have to seem to have them so as to impress other people favorably. Because again, he says, you're no longer free now. You're reliant on all of these other people in all of these different ways, and therefore you have to somehow impress them favorably. And if you can't simply overawe them, and for various reasons you really can't, we haven't actually gotten to the establishment of law yet, but to a large extent, if you don't own a lot of land, if you're not rich in this situation, it's hard to overpower anybody. It's hard to overawe everybody. Therefore, you have to cultivate or somehow impress them in these other ways, as having these other qualities that they find attractive or interesting or somehow or other positive. So he said, you have to pretend to be something that you're not. There's this great division now between the reality and the appearance, and of course, he's thinking even more of society today. You have to appear to be all of these things. You have to take so much concern for your appearance, for what other people think of you, for the way that you seem to them, so that therefore you can have this sort of, you can get the things that you need from them. And this is so much of what he says later on. Civilized man lives outside of himself. Savage man, natural man, just has this sense of his own existence. He's aware of his own needs. He answers them, and that's it. And life is simple, and it's pleasant, and it's sweet, according to Rousseau. For civilized man, there's this image of himself that exists in the eyes of everybody else. And that's what he really needs to worry about, because again, it's these other people that he needs more than he needs anything that he can get for himself. Therefore, he begins to live outside of himself, as Rousseau says. He begins to become obsessed and to think of himself more as this image, as this chimera, this illusion that doesn't even exist in reality, but exists in the idea in the eyes of all these other people. And so he says, this is how people begin to see themselves, and they live outside of themselves, and they just become obsessed with how they seem to other people. And this is vanity in the state of civil society and so on. So that's his first point. You have to appear to be something else so as to favorably impress people. You have to appear to have all of these qualities that are in some ways useful or that favorably impress people. He goes on and he says, from another point of view, behold man, who was formerly free and independent, diminished as a consequence of a multitude of new wants into subjection, one might say, to the whole of nature and especially to his fellow men. So he says, first of all, because of all these new wants, in a sense, man is subjected, is a subject to all of nature, because he has to constantly go out now and get these things that he wants that he didn't even need originally or naturally, but now that he's developed these desires and these tastes for all these new things, now in a sense he's subjugated by all of nature because he's reliant on it, and he has to live his life in a way that he can produce all of these things, and therefore in a sense he's sort of dependent on the entire natural world. in a way that he wasn't before, when he could just go and take what he needed and there was always something. Now, because he needs so many things and he needs so many specific things, now in a sense he is he's living in a state of subjection to the whole of nature for all the things that he needs now, which again he didn't need naturally, he doesn't really need. But he says especially to his fellow men of whom he has become the slave in a sense, even in becoming their master. For if he is rich, he needs their services. If he is poor, he needs their aid. And even a middling condition does not enable him to do without them. So he says, in a sense, now he's enslaved to other human beings. Even if he's rich, he needs the services of other people. If you're rich and you own all of this land, you can't plow it all yourself. You can't develop it all yourself. You're dependent on all of these other people. So you have to find a way to get them to obey you. If you're poor, you need the aid of other people. You need other people just to eat, just to survive. And he says, even in a middling station, you have to deal with people. You have to rely on people all the time in all kinds of different ways. So at this point, he's saying now things have developed to a point where Hobbes's picture of people is largely true. Remember in chapter 10 of the Leviathan, Hobbes talks a lot about all the different ways in which you can show power, or all the different ways in which power manifests itself in human life, largely in terms of people showing honor or dishonor to somebody. When you honor somebody, you're suggesting that they have more power than you. When you dishonor them, you're suggesting that they have less power and you're not worried about them. So all of these different ways that you can show respect or disrespect, honor or dishonor, all of these things, and this is so important for Hobbes because he says you need other people. You rely on all of these other people. Therefore, you're constantly having to show them, if you need them, that you respect them, that you acknowledge their power and so on. And at this point, Rousseau is saying, yes, that's what life and society is like. Because just like Hobbes said, we have all of these desires. They're constantly changing. We're always wanting something new. Rousseau says, again, that's not natural, though. It's true, that's the way that we live now, but that's not natural, and so much the worse. Because for Hobbes, you can at least build a society. This is natural, this constant desire of power after power, this constant change, succession of desires for new things, that's natural. That's just the way that people are, and therefore you can kind of build a society where that can be somewhat satisfied. You can live, a somewhat reasonable or good life, because that's just human nature. Whereas for Rousseau, it's not natural, and therefore we'll never be happy. We'll always be miserable because we're living in a way that isn't natural. And yet nature, that we still have enough nature within us that it's still a standard, and a standard not just in an abstract theoretical sense, but a standard in a sense that will be miserable because we are living in a way that is really against our natures and has done all of this great damage and harm to our natures, and therefore we're in this just sort of worst of all possible worlds where our nature is something very different, and yet we can't get back to that. We can never return to that actual natural state and live in a way that's actually naturally good and naturally happy for us. So he says, we've become dependent on everybody else now. Even if you're wealthy, you need their services and so on. If you're poor, you obviously need their aid. If you're in a middle condition, you still rely on them for all kinds of things. And therefore, again, other people and what they think of you and whether or not they're willing to help you becomes very, very important. So how do you get that? How do you secure their services? How do you secure their help? As he puts it, all of which makes him devious and artful with some, imperious and hard towards others, and compels him to treat badly the people he needs if he cannot make them fear him and does not judge it in his interest to be of service to them. So he says, deceitful and cunning with some. If you have more power, you try to deceive somebody or just flatter them, being artful. If you think you can compel somebody, you'll be hard and imperious and try to force them to do. And he says, and you'll treat badly the people that you need if you don't think there's any other way to get them to do what you want. So he goes on, devouring ambition. Again, it's like he said in that footnote I, after experiencing all of this prosperity and success and having all of these desires gratified, civilized man will, as he put it, end up slitting every throat in the world just so he can be master of the universe. Just this devouring ambition that never actually will be satisfied, will never actually reach an end. He says this is what happens now in this situation. Because again, once you start to get into the situation of comparing yourself to other people, then there's this need to sort of dominate others. There's this need to think that you're better than everybody else. And again, a lot of Hobbesian psychology then becomes true for Rousseau. He's not necessarily completely disagreeing with Hobbes in terms of how people are now or how they were in his day, but he's just disagreeing about whether or not it's natural, which again, in many ways is a very fundamental disagreement. But it doesn't mean that he just completely dismisses everything that Hobbes says. And he goes on and he says, there's this dark propensity to injure one another. Again, people have been set against each other. Now they are competing. Now therefore they have all this reason to injure each other. They are aware of this how much power they have relative to one another, and therefore they want to show that they have more power than other people, and they'll do that in all sorts of dark and cruel ways if that's what it takes. And so, as he puts it, in a word, there is competition and rivalry on the one hand, conflicts of interest on the other, and always the hidden desire to gain an advantage at the expense of other people. Again, this point that he made in that long footnote I in part one, the idea that there's this, as he puts it, the hidden desire to gain an advantage at the expense of other people. There's rivalry, there's competition, conflicts of interest, and then this hidden desire to get the better of other people. This hypocrisy, this fact that we can never fully admit what we're really thinking, what our motives really are. There's this constant need to lie to ourselves, certainly to lie to other people, and again, there's just this constant compulsion to pretend to be something that we're not. As he concludes that paragraph, all these evils are the main effects of property and the inseparable consequences of nascent inequality. So again, so he says, that's now what has happened, as people are now unequal, there's property, they're unequal now, and this is how it changes human nature, and this is how it turns us into what we see now, and this is how, as he put it again in that long footnote I, man is naturally good, or man is wicked. We can see this now. Melancholy experience, he says, shows it, and yet man is naturally good. So how did that happen? How did man who is naturally good become the man that we see around us who is so wicked? And he says, very simple, through the, I mean, it was a long process, but it's a simple answer. The institution of property, and then the inevitable inequality that came from that. And then when you have people hemmed in, they've lost their natural freedom, they've lost their natural equality, and now in this situation where there are all these questions of rank and inequalities, then this is how people become so wicked and so ambitious and so cruel and so on. So he says, that's what happened. That's how society changed forever, obviously for the worse. That's how human beings, the human situation changed forever. But then he goes on, and so in terms of this narrative now, just to go back to this narrative about where civil society comes from. So he says, land was divided up, and yet eventually all the land was taken up. Therefore, as he puts it, landless supernumeraries were wholly dependent on the rich for food. So all of this large number of people who had no land of their own were dependent on the rich, the people who had claimed the land for food. So now they're dependent on them for something essential, something fundamental, simple sustenance, the ability to eat. And he says, therefore, they were obliged to these wealthy people just to get food. And he says the wealthy, now that they had tasted the pleasure of dominating others, he said it was like that was the only desire they had now was to control others, to dominate others, to lord it over others, to show their superior power and so on. He says it's like wolves that have tasted blood, and then all that they want then is human flesh. He says it was the same way they became like that. They became obsessed with this pleasure of dominating others. And yet it turns out, that sort of some of the poor, some of the people who didn't have land were relatively weak, and therefore they simply became subservient, and they did what the wealthy wanted. But some of them were some of the poor, some of the people who didn't have land were strong and thought that they could challenge and attack the wealthy and take their land, which they thought, you don't have any real claim to this. We divided this up because we needed metal and we needed food, and you happen to be the one who started producing the food, but you don't have any legitimate right to this land. For all of these reasons that Rousseau talks about, nobody asked you to do this and so on. So he says, you have no real right to take this land, and therefore people will go and would attack. So it was the strong against the first occupants of the land. Murder, war, all of this stuff resulted from this. As he puts it, nascent society gave place to the most horrible state of war, because again, you have some people who have land, some people who have no land, and therefore they attack. And therefore this first form of society that lasted very briefly, where everything was divided up, all of a sudden the poor said, why should we take this? Why should we, we didn't authorize you to take all the land from us. Nobody asked you to go out and do this. So you've simply taken this land and now you're acting like it's yours, and therefore we're going to attack and take it from you. So Rousseau describes it as the usurpations of the rich, the brigandage of the poor, and the unbridled passions of everyone, stifling natural pity, and the as yet feeble voice of justice, made men greedy, ambitious, and bad. So again, the war between both sides, and again, all of these passions now that have been released, this desire for domination, this desire for taking what people have, this contest over these now what are scarce resources because the land has all been divided. He says that stifles natural pity. Now all of that natural pity that used to make people abhor harming each other, that's gone now. That's been sort of completely overtaken and silenced by all of these other passions. And as yet, he says there really was no voice of justice. The justice, people hadn't really conceived of that very well, to the extent that they could figure out the voice of justice was feeble, as he puts it. So all of this made men greedy, ambitious, and bad. So this was the worst case. Now it was, again, as Hobbes says, now it was a war of all against all. But Rousseau says the rich in particular bore the brunt of the difficulties. They in many ways had the worst situation, or at least they had the most to lose. As he puts it, the risk of life was universal, but the risk of property there is alone. So everybody was risking their life fighting, but the rich had the chance of not only losing their life, but also their property. Rousseau goes on and says, furthermore, whatever disguises they might put upon their usurpations, they knew well enough that they were founded on precarious and bogus rights, and that force could take away from them what force alone had acquired without their having any reason for complaint. So he says they knew that they had really just kind of taken the land and had no real legitimate claim to it. Therefore, they realized that even if they tried to justify it, they really didn't have any meaningful justification, and therefore there was no way for them to reason with the poor and convince them that they shouldn't attack. So he says the rich were the ones then who actually led the way in creating the first social contract, which Rousseau says was totally illegitimate. This was not a good social contract. This was not a legitimate or a fair social contract. But this was the first social contract. It was created by the rich to serve their own interests. And in this way, law and political society were created. And so he says the rich actually basically came out and said, we have to stop this war. Let us institute law that will treat everybody equally, that will protect us all, that will make everybody subject to the same wise laws, will protect all the members of the community under the rule of law, and will also unite us and help us protect ourselves from outsiders. And Rousseau says, obviously the rich had everything, because the laws basically encoded their own wealth and their own superior status and their own superior wealth. Basically, that was a lot of what the law was saying this is permanent now. And so he says, this is what happened. This is how it happened, and the rich were the ones who profited. And he says that's just what makes sense. But he says, most people couldn't figure that out at the time. He says the rich obviously saw that it was disadvantageous to the poor, that it was in a way unjust, or that it was really just a trick on their part to ensure their own advantage. But they obviously weren't going to let on about that. He says, most people who would end up being losers in this scenario, they could see what was wrong with this constant war of all against all, but they didn't have the experience of political society, of civilized life, to understand what the disadvantages would be. So they could all see what was wrong with the current situation, but very few people could actually understand what was being proposed well enough to understand what the problems would be. And even if there were a few wise people who somehow could see that, they looked at this constant war between everybody and realized, well, we have to stop this. Even if there will be obvious, problems, and even if this social contract, if this society that's being proposed will obviously be unfair, it will still be better than this just, this constant bloodshed and war that we have now. So he says, so that's how it happened, and that's how society was created. As he puts it on page 122, such was or must have been the origin of society and of laws, which put new fetters on the weak and gave new powers to the rich, which irretrievably destroyed natural liberty, established for all time the law of property and inequality, transformed adroit usurpation into irrevocable right, and for the benefit of a few ambitious men, subjected the human race thenceforth to labor, servitude, and misery. So that's what happened. This obviously he's not admiring this development. Transform adroit usurpation into irrevocable right. The wealthy had simply taken the land, no real justification for it, and yet once civil society was formed, then it was taken as irrevocable right. And the idea of private property became sort of one of the foundations of political society, of any system of laws, and therefore things changed forever. And as he says, this subjected the human race thenceforth to labor. People had to work now. They were no longer naturally free just to go out and take what they wanted from nature. They had to actually work for all kinds of things. Servitude, this inequality now was created in misery because, again, losing their natural freedom, people were now miserable. And so he says, this is what happened. The wealthy proposed this for their own advantage. People didn't fully understand that. They accepted it, and this first society was founded, this first system of laws, which permanently created this system of inequality, and therefore with inequality the loss of natural freedom. So again, this is just misery from here on out for human beings. And then as he goes on, he explains all of this, and then he says, therefore, once one society had done this, other societies had to form, and they had to form codes of law, and you had different societies, different nations, different early nations emerge, and you inevitably had war between them and conflict there. And so he, although Rousseau in many ways is very critical of many aspects of the Enlightenment, the idea that civilization is superior to nature, that there is progress through time, that things are getting better rather than worse. We've seen again and again, that's his argument. Things are actually getting worse. We're actually much less happy than we were when we lived in a more primitive state. He disagrees that the arts and sciences make people better or happier. We see here in this passage that I'm about to read, he still very much agrees with and embraces a lot of the universalism of the Enlightenment, the idea that, again, all human beings are naturally equal, that naturally that's the way that people should live. And so he criticizes here in this very powerful passage the emergence then of war, that as societies, as the human race is divided into different societies, into different nations, they necessarily compete with one another. There's necessarily conflict, and then you have the emergence of war, which he describes, and he says, and this was far worse than anything that ever happened in the state of nature. So as he, at the bottom of page 122, the bodies politic, thus remaining in the state of nature in their relationship to each other, soon experienced the same disadvantages that had forced individuals to quit it. The state of nature proved indeed even more harmful to these large bodies than it had previously been for the individuals of whom they were composed. From this there arose wars between nations, battles, murders, reprisals which make nature tremble and offend reason, and all those horrible prejudices which count the honor of shedding human blood a virtue. The most decent men learned to regard the killing of their fellows as one of their duties, and in time men came to massacre one another by thousands without knowing why, committing more murders in a single day's battle and more atrocities in the sack of a single city than were committed in the state of nature throughout entire centuries over the whole face of the earth. Such are the first effects we note of the division of the human race into different societies.